space race, something we've always heard about, how we won, how we landed on the moon. However, we did not win as much as we wanted to. In fact, a lot of it was won by the Soviets. The Soviets had always had a hand in rocketry. In fact, throughout most of the 1920s and 30s, they had about kept pace with German development, creating multiple rocket launcher systems for their military, such as the one seen here. But due to the Stalinist purges of 1938 and 1939, they lost most of their advantages in the field. However, after World War II, the Soviets, having also captured a bunch of V-2 ballistic missiles from the Germans, captured German scientists and put them to work, much like the US did under Operation Paperclip. A Soviet man named Sergei Korolev would end up leading this charge, as he, due to his major influence, was able to keep the Soviet space program successful during the early years. What started the space race, however, was the 1955 announcement by Dwight D. Eisenhower, the current president, that the US was going to try and get a man-made object into orbit as soon as they could. The Soviets, hearing about this, decided to make the same announcement, thus igniting the space race. The Soviets would score one of their many victories in the space race when, on October 5th, the Soviets managed to launch Sputnik 1 into orbit, creating the first man-made satellite, and thus winning the first challenge of the space race. The Soviets won their second victory when, in November 3rd of that year, they launched a small dog named Laika aboard another satellite, thus managing to win the title of the first living animal in space. However, she only lived a few hours due to the stress and died much earlier than the Soviets wanted. February 1st of 1958, Explorer 1 managed to make it into orbit around the Earth. Thus, the US had launched their first man-made satellite 2.5 years after the Soviets. Later that year, in July, President Eisenhower signed NASA into law, thus focusing all space operations within their purview. In July of 1961, Ham the Chimp made the first primate in space when he was launched aboard a small rocket from the US air bases. However, this was completely overshadowed when, on April 12th of 1961, Yuri Gagarin made the first manned flight and orbit around the Earth aboard a small capsule, thus becoming the first human in space. Only on May 5th did the US manage to get a human into space, Alan Shepard. However, he did not orbit, as his was a ballistic flight. Later that year in September, John F. Kennedy, the sitting president, announced that he would make it NASA's mission to get to the moon and land a person on it by the end of the decade, thus giving NASA only 8 years to go from ballistic manned flight to moon launch. While in February of 1962, John Glenn became the first American to orbit the Earth, the Soviets would still get the majority of the victories, as on June 6 of 1963, Valentina Tereshkova became the first woman ever in space, as the US did not hire women into its space program. The Soviets score another victory in 1964 when V.M. Komarov, K.P. Feoskitov, and B.B. Yegorov made the first multi-manned spaceflight in history. The US would only catch up to this when, on March of 1965, astronauts Gus Grissom and John Young were launched into space aboard Gemini 3. The Soviets would get another victory when, on March 18th of 1965, Alexei Leonov stepped out of his Voskhod 2 module, meaning that he had just made the first spacewalk in history. This didn't mean the US didn't get any victories, as in December of 1965, Gemini 6 and 7 managed to rendezvous in space, thus becoming the first two spacecraft to ever meet together in orbit. However, the Soviets' luck would turn for the worse when, in January of 1966, Sergei Korolev died. His replacement, Kerim Kerimov, did not have the influence that Sergei had. Thus, the Soviet space program slowly began to fall apart. On March 31st, the Luna 10 managed to achieve orbit around the moon, becoming the first man-made object to do so. The Soviets past this point would not have as much luck, as the US very quickly caught up and surpassed them in multiple aspects. In October of 1967, the Apollo 8, with crew on board, managed to go around the moon in a full orbit, thus becoming the first humans to orbit the moon, and thus paving the way for the 1969 moon landing, when Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin managed to land on the moon itself, thus effectively ending the space race. The Soviets, however, did not have as much luck, as on April 23rd of 1967, Vladimir Karamov died when his Soyuz 1's parachute malfunctioned and he plummeted to Earth at full speed. Along with this, the Soviets' moon rocket, the N-1, was never able to breach the atmosphere, as all 4 test flights ended in failures. However, the Soviets would gain one last little uppercut when, in 1971, they launched the first space station into orbit, the Salyut 1. However, the second and final mission to the space station went horribly awry when the Soyuz 11 lost pressure as it was leaving the space station, the 3 crew members aboard suffocating in space before their vehicle managed to get back into Earth atmosphere. The US would catch up when in May 14th of 1973 they launched the Skylab space station, but the Soviets would end up with the last laugh of the space race when, in 1986, they launched the multi-part Mir space station, becoming the first space station that was assembled in modules around the Earth. And thus ends the primary part of the space race. And, in summary, while the Soviets did have many victories, the US overall did win via their moon landing and the existence of the space shuttle, though the US killed way more monkeys than they want to admit.